Welcome back to Space Reviewed. I'm Andy. For my 7th and final episode of this mini-series, I'm going to be reviewing this, the X-37B. The X-37B is an unmanned space shuttle operated by the US Air Force, and actually that's pretty much all that is publicly known about it. This is the official description: an experimental test program to demonstrate technologies for a reliable, reusable, unmanned space test platform for the US Air Force. One of the really interesting words in that is reusable. Of course, the space shuttle was reusable, but the boosters used to launch it weren't, and actually it needed a lot of maintenance work between flights. So true reusability is something a little bit new. Reusability is a trend in space launch more generally. This is a video of the boosters from a commercial launch by Elon Musk's company SpaceX coming in to land, ready to be refurbished for the next launch. Because they don't have to pay to make new boosters every time, this helps keep the cost of launch down. But back to the X-37B's mysterious activities. The US have said it's being used to conduct experiments in space, which it then brings back to Earth. That's really useful because normally if something breaks on an experimental satellite, you have very limited means of figuring out what went wrong. By putting the experiment on the X-37B, you are guaranteed the ability to bring it back to the lab later and investigate. But the secrecy around this spacecraft means that there are a whole raft of conspiracy theories, things that it could be doing. I should make clear that I'm not saying the X-37B is actually doing these things, or even that I think it is, but they're interesting to talk about, because they illustrate a range of things, from the entirely plausible to the totally wacky, that could be done. The first, and most straightforward, is that the X-37B could be used to launch small satellites. The Space Shuttle was used to launch satellites, and the International Space Station is currently used for it too. This image is of some tiny satellites being launched from the ISS. There's a couple of reasons the X-37 would be useful for this. The first is that because small satellites are often launched by piggybacking on bigger satellites, they don't usually get to choose the exact orbit they go into. By launching them on something that can move around in space, you could put several small satellites into precise orbits from a single launch. A second benefit, for a military launch, comes from the fact that stuff in space isn't tracked all the time. Launches are watched to figure out where and when new satellites are placed in orbit, but after that things are only tracked occasionally. By delaying releasing any satellite it was carrying until a bit after launch, when no one was watching, the X-37B could put something in orbit without the likes of China or Russia spotting it. Another thing the X-37B could be useful for is constructing a really big satellite. This is an animation of the construction of the International Space Station. It was too big to launch on a single rocket, so it was built up out of modules over time. Similarly, the X-37B could be used to build a large, modular satellite, or to replace parts in one. Perhaps you remember the hexagon spy satellites and the film canisters that they used. Well, the X-37B could have been used to retrieve those canisters and load up new film. A more out-there idea is that the X-37B could be used to capture satellites already in orbit and bring them back to Earth for analysis. You might recognise this image as a still from the James Bond film You Only Live Twice. In that film, a terrorist organisation hijacks several US and Russian space capsules. That seems unlikely, but I can certainly see that catching and reverse engineering an adversary's satellite might be an interesting thing to be able to do. Of course, they'd notice the satellite was missing pretty quickly, and it would probably end badly. Another idea that involves bringing stuff back from space is asteroid mining. This asteroid recently made the news because scientists figured out it probably contains a large amount of gold, as well as other metals. Mining asteroids for resources that are scarce and therefore valuable on Earth could be an interesting way to make money in the future. The cost of getting to an asteroid and back to Earth is prohibitive for now, but that might change. particularly if we start being able to process the raw material and make stuff in space as well, including for any future bases on the Moon or Mars. Making stuff in space is an interesting idea. If you're in orbit, you don't experience gravity, and there isn't any oxygen to tarnish surfaces. There are a small number of manufacturing processes that those conditions could be really useful for. For example, there's a particular type of glass that, when it's made on Earth, forms crystals that make it kind of foggy. But if you make it in orbit without gravity, the crystals don't form, and you get glass that is much clearer than the regular glass we use now. That would be great for fibre optic cables. You could cover much longer distances without having to boost the signal. But back to what we know for sure about the X-37B. It's reusable, which is cool, and it's mysterious. But maybe it's a little too mysterious. I give the X-37B 4 stars out of 5.